Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Peter Holle. I'm with the Frontier Center for Public Policy. This is an independent think tank that is based in Western Canada. Our head office is in Winnipeg. And a little bit about Frontier. It has been around since 1999. It has 3 offices in each of the Western Prairie provinces. And it has a budget of about $2 million a year and a staff of 10. We do public policy research among a wide area of public policy, healthcare, education, Aboriginal policy. One of our newer areas is the environmental area, which we call the Smart Green Project. Our view is that we can be environmentalists, but also have a smart green perspective, and we do have a summary of our smart green principles, which are available on our website. We were very fortunate about a year ago to make the acquaintance of Elizabeth Nickson. Elizabeth Nickson is a very well-experienced journalist from British Columbia, and she wrote a best-selling book called Eco-Fascists, which was released last year. And that book is an American book. It's a story of how environmental policy is actually harming the environment. And we, in discussion with her, invited her to write about the Canadian situation with environmental policy, and we were delighted that to bring her on board, and she is now a senior fellow at the Frontier Center and is doing a lot of work, essentially a Canadian version of the book called Eco-Fascists. One thing that I'd like to say before I hand it over to Elizabeth is that the environment in Canada is improving, and there is a paper that is available on our website called The Environmental State of Canada, 2013 update, and it has various hard figures which show that in fact the environment in Canada has never been better, that it is improving, and that it's essentially a very good news story. Much of the tone of environment policy today in Canada is alarmist and quite negative, and is calling for the government to bring in all sorts of tough policies, and we disagree with that. And so I would invite you to check out some of the facts on the state of Canada's environment. At this point, I will introduce Elizabeth. Elizabeth was the European bureau chief for Time magazine once upon a time, and a well-experienced columnist with many newspapers, including the National Post. And with that, Elizabeth, over to you.
Okay, so I wrote Eco-Fascists, and it came out of my own experience as a landowner in British Columbia. I owned 30 acres that I had to sell a piece of, and ran into an organization which is becoming more and more typical all over the world. Ours is called the Islands Trust. Here you have the Niagara Escarpment Commission. You have all kinds of conservation authorities and an entire range of outfits, much like the Islands Trust. The trust in Canada's Gulf Islands is generally regarded by many of its citizens or residents or clients as a destructive organization that has stunted growth, driven most of the young people off the islands, has raised property prices to the point where only the very wealthy can afford to live there, and in many ways has not helped the environment. And having experienced that, their process towards good green land development, which is in place all through Ontario, we are discovering, I started asking questions about whether what was happening in British Columbia was happening elsewhere? And the answer to that was yes, it was. And what were the results? So I basically got in my car and drove into the backcountry of the United States, mostly because I discovered that most of the money and the ideology was coming from the U.S. And I found several quite shocking things. The first was that since 1980, the environmental movement has cleared 40 million rural Americans from their lands, that they, in the States, have set aside, within a couple of years, they will have set aside over half of their land base, 1.1 billion acres, and that a lot of those acres are starting to die because the science that they're using is as flawed and new as climate science. Now, I'm not saying that it doesn't have a great deal in it that is good. When I did my subdivision, I covenanted half my land. I built a salmon enhancement project at the foot of my creeks, and I built a greenhouse. Some of it I was my arm was twisted around my back to do it, but I was a willing participant. I thought it was a good thing. However, these mechanisms through regulation have been forced upon working rural Americans and Canadians and have basically collapsed the rural economy, turned what was once a thriving rural economy into really a series of ghost towns and warehoused marginal people. And it's sad. It's a very sad thing. So that was basically the story of Eco-Fascists. And then Peter came along and asked me to look at what's happening in Canada. And while the situation in Canada is organized in slightly different ways, it's much of a muchness. Rural Canada is caught in a deflationary spiral, essentially. And that has happened through a combination of bad regulation, environmental NGOs forcing their will on rural residents, and a collection of very wealthy first world foundations who spend their money supporting this bad regulation and the ruination of ordinary working and middle class people. So that is what we are trying to establish here. Who's behind it? What were the bad laws? How have rural people been damaged? How do we fix it? Who's behind the money? Why is the money operating the way it is? Because it could be doing some really wonderful things, and it is not. It is doing destructive things. Basically. And now I'm going to turn it over to Richard Stoneman, who is an actual concerned citizen.
Hi. Can you hear me? I'll just speak up. I'm a resident of Norfolk and a resident of Toronto, and I've had a house in Norfolk for about 8 years. I became a bit concerned when I saw public roads being closed, closing down of prime farmland to grow weeds, and charitable foundations led by the Weston family shutting down farms to grow carbon credits rather than food. The Conservancy group now own about 40,000 acres in Norfolk County. That represents 10% of the county. Sorry about that. That's 10% of the county, and the tax base is shrinking as the Conservancy group remove buildings and homes from the land they've purchased. At issue is a 100-year-old rural community where people have jobs and families, and these jobs are being taken away as they shut down the farming communities. About 3 months ago, I drove to Ottawa to hear Jack McLaren, Elizabeth, and Jessica Annis speak and got quite interested. Recently, we've organized a meeting in Port Rowan, one of the local towns, where we expect 300 people. That'll be chaired by Toby Barrett tomorrow evening. A lot of this is driven by the tax code, and these charitable foundations that are buying land They're not using their own money. 62 cents of every dollar that they use comes from the taxpayer. The question is this a charitable activity or an uncharitable activity? A lot of us think it's uncharitable and should be stopped. That's it.
So I guess my first question, I'm a little confused as to why a Western policy think tank focusing on the Prairie provinces specifically has come to Ontario in this case, and why you're starting here.
I think it's a Canadian story, and same issues apply out west as they do in Ontario. So it fits into the narrative of the Smart Green project. So we're not limited to specifically Western issues. We have talked about Canadian healthcare and a number of issues that cut nationally across the country.
Also, when we started doing our initial research, most of the ideas that are being prosecuted in the rest of Canada, including the West, started here and were first developed here. And are actually, my suspicion is, although I don't know, it's worse here than it is in Manitoba, Alberta, or even BC, which is very kind of green and occasionally very stupidly green. But Ontario, as it has with most of Canada, pioneered the ideas.
What ideas exactly did Ontario pioneer?
Well, I think you've integrated conservation authorities into the bureaucracy very early on. In the rest of Canada, they're still acting as sort of client bureaucracies of the main land use agencies, like the Ministry of Environment or Ministry of Natural Resources. And much of the science that this is based on hasn't been thoroughly tested. And we know that because in the U.S., where in specifically as a case study, we've used the Western forest, which includes the BC forest. It's a temperate rainforest that grows 4 times faster than any other temperate rainforest in the world. And since the '93 shutdown that Clinton executed for the sake of the spotted owl, the Forest Service has done audits on its forest, and it's found that the ecosystem management that's been forced on these forests by the environmental movement has caused the forest to start to die, because they don't allow proper maintenance, they don't allow thinning, they don't allow selective harvesting. So what you used to have were 60 to 80 really healthy trees in an acre, and now you've got 400 or 500, and they're spindly and they're grown together and they're twisted and their immune systems are weakened and they're dying. And this has happened on the ranges that have been cleared of cattle, the water system. It's not. Please believe me when I say that a lot of this is not bad idea. It's just new ideas that have not been properly worked out, and they've not been tested, and they haven't been rationally evaluated. So that's what we would like to start happening, is a rational evaluation of environmental policy.
You're in favor of regulation, just regulation that is more favorable to industry than it is to the environment in some cases.
I wouldn't make that distinction at all. I think that a healthy economy and a healthy environment have to go together. If you don't have a healthy economy, the environment invariably suffers. We can see that in the Gulf Islands, where the outer islands, because there's no industry or commercial activity allowed by the trust, all the young people leave. The older people lose their services because there's no tax base to support any service, and the fields and forests and ranges are turning to desert. There isn't no such thing as a natural environment which has been previously tended and used. So if you let a farm go to its natural state, it goes to weed. The weed becomes invasive and it travels. And there's all kinds of new sort of diseases that are being discovered in these so-called wildlife refuges. again, this is all quite new. I mean, people are just beginning to discover what happens to formerly used land that's gone into conservation.
You mentioned the Frontier Center has a report saying that the Canadian environment is in better shape than it ever has been, but yet Bill C-38 effectively gutted most environmental regulation and policies across the country, so we don't have the mechanisms to gain the data that we would need to be able to know the quality of Ontario's and the rest of the country's environment. So how can you put out that claim, and how can you say that some of the conservation's approaches are too early tested when we are effectively doing away with some of the ways in which we might know what the value of that research would be? I don't understand how you can make that claim.
Can you take that?
Well, those data sources are there, and, you know, I can give you a brief summary. Conventional air pollution has declined. Sulfur dioxide is down 57% between 1996 and 2009. Only Sweden in the world has a higher quality, higher rated quality of water. We are a leader in forest conservation in Canada. The forest cover is actually increasing. And if we want to look at greenhouse gas emissions on a per unit of GDP basis, our greenhouse gas emissions have fallen 27% between 1990 and 2010. So those data are out there. I'm not sure. You're suggesting that there will be no more data out there because of Bill C-38?
I'm suggesting that C-38 has made it a lot harder for organizations to be able to collect that data in order to be able to lead to findings like this.
I can't comment to that. I doubt that they have eliminated this data.
And can I just say that that environmental assessments before Bill C-38 were so long and torturous that often the benefits in any projected project were not captured because the environmental assessments took so long. This is an ordinary tactic of environmental activists, and sometimes they're right, and a lot of times they are wrong. And if you go and talk to rural people, and I don't mean just rural resource producers, the mill owners and forest owners, but the people on the ground, and you go out, and almost nobody does that. You know, I worked at Time Inc. for 7 years and worked for every major broadsheet in the UK and the US and Canada. And when I went out traveling, they had none of these people in any of these towns and regions and forests and rangeland systems had ever encountered a member of the mainstream press. Nobody went there, nobody asked them questions, nobody ever checked the alarmist statements of the ENGOs that constantly scare us with the fact, oh my God, the sky is falling. Trust me, try to start a business in the country and you will see how tough our environmental regulations still are.
I understand, and I appreciate the fact that it is worth going back and taking a look at how regulations can be improved. I'm not suggesting that they are perfect, far from it, but I sort of feel in a way as if you're almost throwing the baby out with the bathwater by calling these people eco-fascists. Personally, I don't know how helpful that is to the conversation when there is something to be learned from a lot of those rural residents who are, some of them I'm sure, are conservationists or who have firsthand knowledge of how that land operates in good land.
Every farmer, rancher, and forester works in their chosen field, calls themselves an environmentalist, and they say that they are the true environmentalists, that the people that come in, the activists that move into their community and start reconfiguring their economy are eco-fascists. That's how they see them, because that's how they've seen their communities destroyed. And I guess to that extent, I'm on their side, because I've seen the devastation that they have caused. And I think that Bill C-38 was a good step in rationalizing their behavior and holding them to account. If environmental NGO like Greenpeace or the Sierra Club or any of the 3,000 that we have in Canada go into a town and say this mill must be closed, this water system must be reconfigured, they do not bear any of the responsibility for the results of their actions. They pack up and leave and they never return. And what they leave behind them is a broken economy and a broken town and a destroyed tax base. And there is so much really hard evidence of human communities being ruined by these people. And the term eco-fascist was invented by Robert Hunter, the founder of Greenpeace, who said on the first voyage of the Rainbow Warrior that the biggest fear that he had was that the movement would turn out to be what the movement has turned out to be.
In Ontario, do you believe that wind turbine opponents are eco-fascists? They're essentially opposing. I'm curious because from your own experience of trying to find a new commercial use for private land, in that case, you wanted to make it more productive as a land base. And in many ways, I would argue that might be what the government is trying to do with wind turbines in rural Ontario to be able to help create jobs in those economies. They might argue that. Where you have people in those communities that are opposing them, are
Yes.
they eco-fascists?
People opposing wind turbines. Well, do you want to speak to the wind turbine economic kind of disaster, or?
Well, wind energy is not a reliable source of power. It's expensive. I understand Ontario that local wishes have been overridden by the master plan. Certainly, people don't have the say in the siting of these things often. Richard, do you know anything about this one?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably the most inefficient way that you can address power needs. And also in Ontario and places where it's been tried, carbon generation actually increases with wind turbines. It doesn't decrease, because if you shut down a nuclear to produce wind, then you need a backup source of power, which is a cogen plant. Nuclear produces no carbon. The cogen plant produces lots of carbon. So in Ontario, carbon generation is increased with wind. I mean, it's perverse, but that's what it is. And if you want to go on the road, take a drive down to Port Dover, and it's one of the most beautiful areas in Ontario, and you're going to be faced with a forest of wind turbines which blight the visual skyline, and they're not turning.
I guess I'll wrap it up then. Is there any timeline for when a report or findings might be coming out? Because you mentioned that there is a project that you're working on.
I think we're shooting for the spring next year, but there will be some preliminary information coming out within the next month.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And effectively what you indicated earlier, it's the same model as the US-based book, but just looking at the same kinds of Canadian regulations and the same kinds of impacts.
I think the plan for us is to have something which is more user-friendly in terms of providing practical advice to our policymakers. So less of a novel, more of a list of good policy principles and recommendations for improving what we have.
These before provincial governments and the federal government? Would they
Yes.
be broken up by province?
I think Ontario has its own section because what's happened here is so very interesting, and I can't at the moment remember how we've broken up the other chapters, because right now I'm completely caught by Ontario. And can I just say, with regard to alternative energy, I have heat my house with geothermal. I did put in a geothermal plant, and as a result, except for the propane that I cook with, my house is carbon neutral because in Canada we have run-of-the-river hydro projects. But that plant cost me $60,000. It added $60,000 to the cost of a house. It's wonderful. If I had a choice, that's how I would heat my house. It's far superior to any other heating method that there is. It's just that we're not ready to afford many of these things. We need a much more growing economy before we can sort of mandate that wind energy do what it apparently can do. I mean, there are all kinds of arguments against wind energy, and I think that when people protest against it being installed in their region, they should be listened to. I'm a very firm advocate of local people being equal participants at the table. Okay? Okay. Okay. Well, you were an excellent interviewer. Being the solitary interviewer, you did a very good job.